The fourth morning Fatima walked into the conference room. She carried the weight of 3 years of research in a sealed folder. Her hands didn't shake. They never did in professional settings. She'd learned early that emotions were luxuries people like her couldn't afford. The pharmaceutical company she worked for, Helix Biotech, was launching their newest drug candidate, and she'd spent countless nights analyzing molecular structures, running trials, documenting failures that led to one breakthrough. Her supervisor, Mr. Thornton, stood at the podium with the folder open in front of him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth like expensive leather, "I'm proud to present to you the culmination of months of dedicated work. Our team has developed a revolutionary approach to treating chronic inflammation that could change lives." Fatima sat in the third row, next to her colleague Rashid, who squeezed her hand. She'd told him everything: how she'd identified the protein interaction, how she'd redesigned the compound, how she'd stayed until midnight 3 nights in a row to verify the results. His squeeze meant this is your moment, but it wasn't. "My vision," Thornton continued, "combined with our top-tier research methods, has resulted in this breakthrough. My vision. Not my team's vision. Not Fatima's discovery. My vision." The words landed like stones in her chest. Around her, people nodded, impressed. A few glanced at Thornton with admiration. No one looked at Fatima. She became invisible in that moment, not because people couldn't see her, but because no one was looking. After the presentation, colleagues congratulated Thornton. He smiled, basked, accepted champagne. Fatima excused herself to the bathroom and locked the stall door. She didn't cry then. Her eyes had learned not to betray her. That evening, she requested a private meeting. Thornton's assistant scheduled it 3 weeks away. She went home to her small apartment, ordered nothing, ate nothing, and sat with the hollow knowledge that her work had been stolen. Not in a dramatic way, in the quiet, institutional way that happens to women in science all the time. It was normalized theft, and that somehow made it worse. The next morning, Fatima called in sick. She wasn't lying. By afternoon, she'd updated her resume and sent 17 applications. By evening, she'd received 1 rejection. By the next day, 5 more. Her qualifications were excellent. But there was something else working against her. Perhaps the small gaps in her employment history. Or perhaps something less definable. The invisible weight that follows women who've been invisible for too long 3 days later. Fatima was on the evening train heading home from an interview that had gone nowhere. The interviewer had seemed distracted, like he'd already made his decision before she'd spoken. She changed to the city bus at the central station. The line she'd taken 100 times before. The bus arrived crowded. She stood near the doors, holding her interview folder like armor. At the next stop, the doors opened, and the crowd shifted. Her foot caught on nothing. Not on anything, really. Just on the absence of solid ground beneath her. She fell forward, her papers flying everywhere like released birds, scattering across the grimy station floor. People stepped around her. A child pointed. A woman checked her phone. No one stopped. Fatima lay there for 7 seconds. She would count them later, her face against cold concrete, professional papers dissolving into the indignity of public failure. This was the moment something inside her cracked. Not from the fall itself, but from the collective weight of every time she'd been overlooked, underestimated, and rendered invisible. That's when Hassan knelt down beside her. The listening Hassan had been running late for his shift at the cafe when he saw her, not the fall itself, but the moment after, when she was still on the ground and everyone had moved on. He'd learned something working minimum wage jobs. Invisibility was contagious. People avoided the fallen because falling felt like weakness, and weakness was uncomfortable. He knelt beside her without thinking. Gathering papers before asking if she was okay, Fatima looked up at him, expecting pity. Instead, she found dark eyes that simply waited, without judgment or hurry. He helped her to her feet, brushed dust from her jacket, and didn't ask if she was all right. He just stood there, holding half her papers. As if to say, "Take the time you need." "Thank you," she whispered. "Coffee?" he asked. "There's a cafe 2 blocks from here." The owner doesn't care if you sit for hours." She should have said no. She didn't know this man. But something in his voice, a gentleness born from understanding, made her follow. The cafe was small, tucked between a laundromat and a closed bookstore. Hassan made her tea without asking what she wanted, somehow knowing she needed something warm and uncomplicated. He sat across from her during his break, not forcing conversation, just being present. "Bad interview?" he asked, noticing her folder. "Bad everything," she said, surprising herself with honesty. He nodded. "I know that feeling." Over the next 3 weeks, Fatima found herself returning to that cafe. Hassan was always working afternoon shifts, and she'd arrive at 4 o'clock, order tea, and sit in the corner table. They talked slowly, carefully, like people learning a new language. Hassan told her about his band, the Fractured Strings, which played at Underground. Venues, 2 audiences of 12 people, maybe 20 if they were lucky. He'd been a music education major once, then dropped out when his father had a stroke. Now he worked mornings at a delivery company and afternoons at the cafe, playing gigs at night when his body could handle it. He hadn't slept properly in 2 years. "Why do you keep doing it?" Fatima asked one evening as rain drummed against the cafe windows. "Because some part of me still believes it matters," Hassan said. "Even if no one's listening. I guess I have to believe that. Otherwise, what's the point of anything?" It was the saddest thing she'd ever heard, and also the most beautiful. Fatima told him about Helix Biotech, about Thornton, about the way her research had been erased like she'd never existed. She expected Hassan to tell her to move on, to get over it, to be practical. Instead, he listened like her words were the most important thing in the world. "You know what I think?" Hassan said one night as they walked through the quiet streets near the train station where they'd met. "I think you're still here because you're meant to do something bigger. The falling part, the invisible part, that's not where your story ends. That's just where it changes direction." Fatima had spent her life believing in logic, in science, in what could be measured and proven. But walking beside Hassan under the city lights, she felt something shift. Maybe growth wasn't always about being recognized. Maybe it was about finding one person who saw you completely. Their relationship deepened without a formal beginning. There was no moment where they became a couple. There was only the gradual realization that they'd become each other's anchor. Hassan would leave work with flowers still in his dark hair. Fatima would notice the way he smiled differently when she appeared. She'd bring him notebooks where she sketched pharmaceutical formulas, and he'd bring her vinyl records of artists no one had heard of yet, playing them on the portable speaker she kept in her apartment. Late nights, they'd sit on her balcony overlooking the city, and Hassan would play his guitar while Fatima listened. Not because the music was perfect, it wasn't always, but because it was honest. It was Hassan's heart translated into sound, and she'd learned that honesty was more beautiful than perfection. "I'm scared," Fatima admitted one night, 3 months after the fall. "Scared that this is all I'll ever be. Scared that being invisible is my default setting." Hassan set his guitar down and took her hand. "You're not invisible. You were just looking in the wrong places for proof. You were waiting for people like Thornton to validate you. But validation from people who steal your work? That's not real validation. Real validation comes from knowing your own worth. And from people like me who see it without needing a presentation to understand it." Now she leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time since Thornton had taken her credit, she felt something other than anger or despair. She felt hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. Neither of them knew it yet. But they were building something in those late-night conversations. Not just a relationship, but permission. Permission to dream differently. Permission to fail and try again. Permission to become the people they were meant to be, together. The awakening apartment that became Fatima's office was barely larger than her bedroom. She'd rented it with her severance from Helix Biotech. The irony that they'd paid her to disappear wasn't lost on her. But she'd used that money strategically, setting aside funds to start something that was entirely hers. "You're really doing this?" Hassan asked, helping her carry a used lab-grade centrifuge up 3 flights of stairs. It had cost more than she'd wanted to spend. Purchased from a university research program that was downsizing. "I have to," Fatima said, breathless not from the climb, but from the enormity of what she was attempting. I can't work for anyone else. I can't be invisible again. Hassan kissed her forehead. You could never be invisible. Not to me. She'd started small. A pharmaceutical consultancy targeting small biotech startups that couldn't afford the overhead of larger research firms. She spent her first month reaching out to contacts, sending proposals, attending industry mixers where she knew no one. Many doors closed, but some opened. Her first client was Meridian Biotech, a struggling startup working on a new approach to treating autoimmune diseases. Their lead researcher, Dr. Amara, had seen Fatima's proposal and recognized genuine expertise when she read it. They'd hired her for a 3-month contract at a rate that made Fatima's heart race. It was real money. It's a professional-level compensation. Hassan celebrated by cooking her dinner for the first time. It was terrible. The pasta was overcooked. The sauce was somehow both burnt and cold, but Fatima cried while eating it because it was the most loving thing anyone had ever done for her. The work consumed her in the best way. She spent 14-hour days redesigning compounds, running analyses, testing hypotheses, but now the work was hers. Every discovery, every failed experiment, every small breakthrough belonged entirely to her. She didn't have to wonder if someone would steal it. She didn't have to wait for someone else's approval to feel proud. Hassan would arrive at midnight sometimes, bringing food and coffee, sitting silently while she worked. He'd read papers over her shoulder, not understanding the chemistry but understanding her. He'd learned the names of her projects, asked genuine questions, celebrated failures as much as successes because he understood that research was iterative. That falling wasn't the same as failing. 3 months turned into 6. Meridian extended her contract and referred her to another startup. By month 9, Fatima had 3 active clients and a wait list of companies wanting to work with her. She hired her first employee, brilliant but overlooked researcher named Sarah, who'd been working in a dead-end position at a larger firm. Sarah had experience in protein synthesis that complemented Fatima's work perfectly. Together, they expanded the consultancy's capabilities. You realize what you're building? Hassan said one evening as they watched the city lights from her small balcony. The apartment below had been converted into a second workspace. There was barely room to move, but it was bursting with potential. A business, Fatima said. No, Hassan corrected, taking her hand. You're building proof. You're showing everyone, including yourself, that your worth was never dependent on Thornton or Helix or anyone else. You're proof that invisible people can become indispensable. Meanwhile, Hassan's own life was shifting. The fractured strings had grown beyond the underground circuit. A producer had seen them at a small venue and believed in their sound. They were recording their first EP, getting meetings with labels, playing to actual crowds of hundreds instead of dozens. It should have felt competitive to people, both climbing, both grinding. But instead it felt complimentary. Fatima would listen to Hassan's demos while she worked, and his music became the soundtrack to her research. Hassan would sit in on client calls sometimes, hearing how Fatima explained complex science in ways that made people believe in her, and she was always right. Her recommendations didn't just sound good, they worked. One evening, a major pharmaceutical company, not Helix, but a competitor contacted Fatima about a full consulting partnership. They wanted her expertise on a long-term project, offered her a legitimate office space, a real team, resources she'd never dreamed of having. She almost said yes. Hassan listened as she explained the offer. The numbers, the prestige. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Do you want that? Or do you want to keep building what you've built here? Fatima looked around her crowded, chaotic apartment office. At the wall covered with research notes and photos of successful projects. At Sarah's desk in the corner where brilliant work was happening. At the evidence that she'd taken her fall and transformed it into something unshakable. I want this, she said finally. I want what's mine. Hassan smiled. Then that's what you'll build. She declined the offer respectfully, but she used the interest as leverage. 3 months later, her consultancy landed a major contract with a medical research nonprofit focused on rare diseases. The contract came with a significant advance, enough to officially incorporate move into real office space, and hire 2 more researchers. Fatima's transformation wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about becoming so undeniably excellent at what she did that people had no choice but to see her. And more importantly, she'd learned to see herself. She went from the woman on the ground, the train station, to the woman other researchers cited in their papers. Her work was being presented at conferences. She was being invited to speak about her methodologies. The invisible woman had become indispensable, and through every moment of growth, Hassan was there not as an accessory to her success, but as a partner in it. His band was gaining traction, getting radio play, building a real following. But he never let success change how he looked at her. She was still the woman who'd fallen, still the woman he'd believed in before anyone else did. They'd both turned their tables, but not with anger or revenge. They'd turned them with growth, with belief. With the quiet certainty that they were each other's greatest evidence that transformation was possible. The recognition conference hall in Geneva held 3,000 people. Fatima stood backstage, her hands steady but her heart racing as the moderator introduced her. Please welcome Dr. Fatima Rashid, whose groundbreaking research on inflammatory pathways has revolutionized our approach to treating autoimmune conditions.
Dr.
Fatima Rashid. When had she become that person? She walked onto the stage to applause, and somewhere in the crowd, Hassan was filming on his phone. He'd taken a week off from touring to be here. His band, the Fractured Strings, had just signed to an independent label known for breaking new artists. They were supposed to be recording in Los Angeles. Instead, he was in Geneva. Because he understood that some moments mattered more than work. Her presentation was polished but passionate. She spoke about the journey not directly, but in the subtext of her research. She talked about paths that seemed to dead end, about finding new directions. About the importance of persistence when the world told you to give up. The audience listened with the kind of attention that only came when they recognized truth being spoken. During the Q&A session, a woman stood up in the 5th row. She was older, distinguished, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than Fatima's apartment. Dr. Rashid, your methodology is impressive, but I'm curious about your background. You seem to have entered the consulting field rather unconventionally. Can you speak to that? Fatima could have given a professional answer, sanitized and safe. Instead, she chose honesty. I worked for a larger pharmaceutical firm, she said. My research was presented by someone else as their own work. I could have been bitter about that. Could have spent years trying to prove myself through traditional channels. Instead, I chose to build something where I didn't need anyone's permission to validate my work. Turns out, when you're building something that matters, the market finds you. The audience erupted. She could see people nodding, saw the woman in the 5th row smile with understanding. That night, her inbox filled with requests for consulting partnerships. Invitations to collaborate. Offers from universities asking if she'd consider teaching, but the moment she treasured was when she found Hassan after the panel, and he lifted her off the ground and spun her around like they were in a film. And she heard him whisper, "You were perfect. You are perfect." 6 months later, Fatima's consultancy opened its official headquarters in the city, a real office building with 3 floors, a team of 12 researchers, and contracts with some of the world's leading biotech companies. She was making genuine money now. It's the kind that let her buy an apartment she didn't have to rent, that let her think about future security without anxiety. Hassan's band was booking actual tours. They'd released their EP to critical acclaim, and their second single had been featured on a major streaming platform. He was finally sleeping regular hours, finally believing that his dream wasn't a delusion. They celebrated together, the way they'd learned too quietly, intimately away from the noise. One evening, Hassan arrived at the apartment with an unusual nervousness. He'd never been nervous around her before. Fatima immediately knew something was different. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong," he said, then laughed at himself. "Everything's right. That's actually the problem. Or not a problem. I'm doing this badly." He got down on one knee and Fatima's breath caught. The ring was simple white gold with a single diamond that caught. The light like captured starlight. Hassan's hand shook as he held it. "Fatima, you've taught me that transformation is possible. that we don't have to accept the versions of ourselves that the world tries to force on us. I want to spend my life building things with you. I want to keep watching you become more and more yourself. I want to be the person you fall into when you need to. Will you marry me?" She said yes before he'd even finished speaking, and they ended up on the floor laughing and crying. Tangled together the way they'd been tangled since the moment at the train station. The wedding was small. Held in the same cafe where they'd first talked over tea, Dr. Amara from Meridian Biotech came, as did members of Hassan's band. Syra was her maid of honor. They danced to Hassan's original music, the songs he'd written during the late nights when he was still working delivery shifts, songs that had never found an audience until now. At one point, Fatima found herself alone on the cafe's small balcony, looking out at the city that had tried to break her and then allowed her to rebuild. Hassan found her there and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Thinking about the fall?" he asked. "Thinking about how falling led to this?" she said. They stood together in the golden light of evening. Two people who'd learned that the best victories weren't about destroying what had hurt you. They were about becoming so completely yourself that the things that once diminished you became irrelevant. They were about finding someone who saw your worth before you could see it yourself, and they'd found that in each other. The full circle at 12, years after the wedding. Fatima received an email that made her pause mid-morning coffee. The sender was the CEO of Helix Biotech, Thornton, but the woman who'd taken over the company after he'd been quietly removed for ethical violations. The email was formal, but carried an unmistakable tone of reconciliation. They wanted her to receive an award, not a symbolic one, but the Researcher of the Year honor that Helix gave annually to acknowledge outstanding contributions to the field. The irony was almost too much to process. Her work, the work Thornton had stolen, was now being publicly recognized by the very company that had tried to erase her. "You have to go?" Hassan said immediately when she told him. "I don't know if I can face that place," Fatima admitted. "That's exactly why you should go," Hassan said. "Not for them. For you." To close the circle, the awards ceremony was held in the same conference room where she'd watched Thornton take her credit. The room had been renovated, the decor updated, the energy shifted, but some things remained the same. The large windows overlooking the city, the sensation of institutional importance, the weight of professional scrutiny. Thornton wasn't there. He'd moved to a smaller company after his departure from Helix, and his reputation had quietly crumbled as other employees came forward with their own stories of stolen work and stolen credit. His fall had been quiet, bureaucratic, and thorough. Fatima felt almost nothing about it. The CEO gave a speech about the importance of recognizing true innovation, about institutional accountability, about ensuring that credit went to those who deserved it. It was a partial apology without using the word apology, a correction of injustice through official channels. When Fatima walked onto the stage to accept the award, she caught her reflection in the windows, and she barely recognized the woman looking back. She was the same Fatima who'd fallen at the train station, but transformed. More assured, more complete. Not because of this award, but because she'd built something real in the years since. Hassan stood in the third row, recording everything. When she looked at him, he mouthed, "I love you." That night, they did something neither expected. They found themselves on the train, heading toward the central station. Neither had suggested it was mutual, intuitive. The way they'd learned to navigate their life together, they got off at the station where they'd first met. It was late evening, the shops closing, the crowds thinning. They walked to the exact spot where she'd fallen, and Hassan helped her sit down on the bench nearby. "Full circle," Fatima said. "Not quite," Hassan said. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos. He showed her a photo from the cafe, their first date, before they were officially dating. Then, photos from her office opening. Photos from the conferences where she'd spoken. Photos from their wedding. Photos from last week, at the launch of her newest research initiative. "And this is the full circle," he said. "Not a moment. A journey. From falling to building. From invisible to indispensable. From alone to us." Fatima looked at the evidence of their life together, and something crystallized inside her. She'd spent so much energy trying to prove herself to people like Thornton, trying to be recognized by people who barely saw her. But the person who'd truly seen her hood believed in her capacity for transformation before she believed in it herself, was sitting beside her on a bench in a train station. "I want to tell our story," she said suddenly. "What do you mean?" Hassan asked. "I mean, really tell it. In interviews, in writing, in whatever form it takes. Not as revenge against Helix or Thornton, but as evidence that transformation is possible. That women who've been stolen from can rebuild themselves. That invisible people can become indispensable. That falling is just falling until you choose to stand up." Hassan squeezed her hand. "Then we tell it together." They sat on that bench for an hour as the evening turned to night, watching the station lights flicker on, watching people come and go. And in that quiet moment, Fatima understood something fundamental. She hadn't turned the tables with anger or revenge. She'd turned them with growth, with resilience, with the quiet certainty that her work spoke for itself. She'd turned them with Hassan, who'd believed in her when belief was the only thing she had left. 6 months later, Fatima published an essay in a major scientific journal about her journey. It was raw and honest, and it sparked conversations across the industry about recognition, credit, and the invisible women whose work built the foundation of innovation. Other researchers came forward with their own stories. Hassan's band released an album, inspired by their journey, an album about falling and rising, about finding love in unexpected places, about the transformation that comes from choosing each other. The album reached the top of the indie charts and stayed there for months. They were building a life that mattered, not because they'd won against the people who'd hurt them, but because they'd chosen to become more than their injuries. They'd chosen growth over bitterness, love over loneliness, transformation over revenge. And on quiet nights, when they sat on their apartment balcony overlooking the city, Hassan would play guitar and Fatima would listen not to perfect music, but to honest music. To the sound of a man who'd believed in dreams when dreams were all he had. And Fatima would think about the woman on the ground at the train station, and she'd feel something like gratitude. Not gratitude for the fall itself, but gratitude for the person who'd stopped to help her up. Gratitude for the choice to rebuild rather than break. Gratitude for the journey that had led her here. The end.